So I bet you thought that being horror month, I wasn't going to be able to slip a superhero in. Ha! Gotcha, here's Aquaman. And welcome back to the heart of the stories we tell, a series where I spend way too much time thinking about what makes a story. And today's episode is HP Lovecraft and cosmic horror in general. If you tuned in last week, you know that for the month of October, we're doing a Halloween theme, and specifically talking about horror, from our first horror stories to our last, and last week we covered the story Five Nights at Freddy's. This week, instead of doing an individual story, we're doing a whole pantheon of them, and the writer that created the idea of this pantheon and shared universe. So we're doing a creator spotlight on H.P. Lovecraft. The man himself was a bit of a recluse, but at the same time, very outgoing in creating a community. So any discussion of him is a discussion of the zeitgeist known as pulp magazine. Pulp magazine specifically was just around the turn of the century, a little before he started. And what it was magazines that used to have a story here, and then an article that was news here, and then a picture here, decided to change that all up and go to just doing short stories. And these short stories were like the TV of their day. Remember, there was no internet to watch YouTube. You had YouTube delivered in the form of a pulp magazine, and some people wrote different things. His specific amazing fantasy adventures were normally associated with horror, depression, and dark things. The thing is that he made friends with other writers, and instead of having emails like we did now, they actually had correspondence through physical mail. Lovecraft himself, the sad part about his story is that in the end, he thought he was a flop. He never realized how successful he would be and how much he would influence 100 years later writers. Nowhere was that more evident than when I went to Nikon this year. Several of the writers there, very professional ones, with best-selling novels, to Rhode Island, where his gravestone is, to visit every year. His legacy has stretched out across the eons, and all because of one call, the name of his mythos, the Cthulhu mythos. So once again, it's stop, spoiler time. And not quite a trigger warning, but just a heads up. Racism and sexism were pretty rampant in the 30s and 40s, and to be honest, he wasn't very progressive even for his day. So, just heads up if you're going to be reading his stories. The cosmic horror that he specifically was best known for, mixed with the personal horror that came with the ideas that came from there, involved mostly forbidden knowledge, non-human influence on humanity, and the idea of an entirety of civilization being under threat. The more personal horror was normally fate and being forced into finding out something that you didn't even know and didn't want to know. He has some religious overtones with his cosmic powers, especially when it comes to the cults, and superstition plays a big role. Specifically, part of the idea that Lovecraft had was that science itself was only localized. Our science wasn't the science of everything, and the more we explored, the more we knew, the stranger things would get. Now, it's important to remember that his science fiction is, again, being written from the lens of an understanding that's almost 100 years past. He also wasn't a scientist. The same way if I wrote science fiction today, I wouldn't really understand everything about string theory. The same way he didn't understand cutting edge then. And keep in mind he didn't have Google or Wikipedia to go to. So let's talk about Cthulhu himself. The story Call of Cthulhu I first found in a role-playing supplement, and then later went through an audio drama of the entire thing. And it's basically an investigator finding out the stars are right, and this ancient evil creature known as Cthulhu, who worshipped the elder god, is about to wake up. So the Call of Cthulhu is his most famous story, and the one that names the mythos. And what is the call? Well, the call is a psychic emanation from this creature that lives beneath the waves, and is waiting till the stars are right to come out and destroy the earth. Now, whether this creature is an elder god or a worshiper of the elder gods or some variation between the two is up to debate. However, the important part is that he creates a whole mythology, a whole idea of this cosmic scale of creatures. And how do these creatures work? Well, because the universe works differently than we understand. There's a cult that worships him and keeps repeating this phrase over and over again. Panagal Niggalwal Nawaf Cthulhu Rale Walgalath Fatun. Yeah, I probably totally slaughtered that. Cthulhu and Raleigh are really the only important parts. Cthulhu being the actual creature, and Raleigh being the place where he resides under the water. Now, in the book itself, or the story, it's a short story, Cthulhu is defeated. However, the important part that comes out of this, and we'll see show up time and time again, is the book. What book is that? Well, maybe the most overused horror trope book ever, the Necronomicon, Book of the Dead. In story, Lovecraft describes the book as being written by some ancient Arabic man, and the important part here is the world building. You have to remember, this isn't just one story, this is a whole mythos of stories. It's kind of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but long before movies were like that. These stories all linked together, and this Necronomicon tied them together, and ties together many other stories. When we get to influences later, we'll talk about that. This book, along with a handful of other things like the Elder Sign and Miskatonic U, help create the world that is within these stories. And these have then gone on to become prevalent in other things as well. We now have board games and role-playing games and video games that all are directly in the Cthulhu mythos, along with things that are homage. The Arkham Horror game itself has some stats for some of the greatest beings within the universe, and you fight them yourself. But most of his characters weren't really fighting these things. They were more like surviving. And that is what I'm going to say is the heart of the mythos. The idea of these powerful cosmic entities controlling things on such a vast level that are just beyond our comprehension. To even look upon them is madness and horror-inducing. Over the years, the stories have gone one way and the other with whether or not you can or cannot fight them. However, I want to talk to you first about the fact that even though you may not know the mythos, you probably already know part of the mythos. Like I said, HP Lovecraft has been very influential on quite a few authors. Did you know that Jason Goes to Hell specifically has the Necronomicon in it? Hell, that Necronomicon's the same one that we see in Evil Dead. That's the picture I used, and no one knows the difference. Cast a Deadly Spell? Yeah, the main character's name is Lovecraft. And Necronomicon again, along with several others. But even without the Necronomicon, we have things like True Detectives. I know what you're going to say. What's a hard-boiled detective series got to do with it? Well, those King in Yellow and Carcosa things are all throwbacks to HP Lovecraft. And even if you're not going with specific, just theme-wise, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Cartoon actually does a pretty good job at capturing the idea of what is the Cthulhu mythos. So other than Call of Cthulhu, one of his other most famous works, and the one that I most am looking forward to being made into a feature film, is Mountains of Madness. Now, I'll be honest, I had some trouble reading through Mountains of Madness because it's a first-person account done through diary entries and that sort of thing, but it has a very interesting story, and if you can get past the eclectic way it's written, it has a lot of interesting things. In fact, it's the story that popularized the idea of ancient astronauts. And specifically, it deals with an Antarctic expedition that finds out about creatures out of time and from different space. It's very interesting. The story of it being published itself also is a bit of a story into itself. See, originally, Lovecraft was submitting to these pulp magazines, as I said before, and it got turned down for Weird Tales, which is the story that he was writing for the most. And it got picked up a year later by Astonishing Stories. One of the stories that most people would consider a classic story today got turned down multiple times. It's kind of interesting when you think about it. But he did eventually get it published, and it's full of all sorts of things, including a connection to Call of Cthulhu, because the Elder Things record the coming of Cthulhu to Earth and the sinking of Raleigh. Like I said, I was looking forward to it being a movie. I know director Guillermo del Toro had worked on a screenplay of it back about 10 years ago, but Warner Brothers didn't pick it up. I also know that he shopped it around a bit. I know that James Cameron was talking about doing it for a while, but he wanted to bring in big stars. Universal Studios greenlit it, then de-greenlit it, because he wanted an R rating and they wanted a PG-13 rating. There were also a couple of other background issues, but all in all, I think it would make a very interesting modern movie, especially modernized. Lovecraft had some really great ideas that I think are pretty timeless. His idea of what is a horror story and the idea of the unknown, the monster that comes out of nowhere, the insanity of just not being able to comprehend the world around you, are all great themes. And when I think about why we tell horror stories, I think about H.P. Lovecraft. and the fact that he was kind of depressed and never realized that he told some of the greatest horror stories, and maybe even created the concept of cosmic horror. As we walk through the heart of the stories we tell, I want to take a look at a lot more of his work as well. However, I do want to just put where you can find them in the background. A lot of the lower grade movie makers, ones that don't get into the big Hollywood cinemas, make these movies still. So check out the independent scene and see if you can find a good story of HP Lovecraft. And if you do, link it here in the comments. I'd love to hear what everyone here thinks about his work and the monsters he created. Remember, it's an evolving medium. So when you look into this, there's a lot of story. Someone named August Derleth made a lot of changes after Lovecraft's death. But at the end of the day, it's still all Lovecraft's work. It's his ideas, his concept, at the heart of the Call of Cthulhu. So for now, I need you to like, subscribe, and share this video so that we can grow this community, and then join me back here next time when I'm going to take a look at a slightly more personal and smaller version of horror stories, and a fellow YouTuber at that time, as we take a walk through the heart of the stories we tell. Thanks for watching.